The night after the great Khan died, the steppe held its breath like a living thing waiting for permission to exhale. And in the felt tent where the council of princes gathered beneath smoke-blackened rafters, the air tasted of mare's milk gone sour and lamp oil that had burned too long without replenishment. Temuga, eldest surviving son of the man who had turned horizons into borders, sat with his spine straight as lance wood while generals and shamans argued over what pieces of his father's empire would be divided, what alliances needed sealing, what enemies required crushing before they realized the Horde center had gone hollow. And through all of it he kept his face empty of thought, the way his father had taught him. The way a leader must become stone, when stone is what the moment requires. They called him the unmoved, the prince who had never trembled during his first kill at age 12, who had watched his younger brother executed for treason without showing grief, who could hear a city's population screaming as it burned and continue eating his evening meal with steady hands. And this reputation for coldness was why they trusted him with the leather scroll case that was passed across the felt carpet just before dawn, sealed with the Khan's own mark, pressed into wax that had been mixed with his blood so that anyone who broke the seal would be handling the dead man's essence. Inside were 3 sheets of parchment, each one covered in names written in the Mongolian script that Temuga's father had commissioned from captured Uyghur scholars. And beside each name was a symbol indicating category: chroniclers who had written unfavorable accounts, tribal leaders who had resisted too effectively before surrendering, families whose loyalty was uncertain, children who carried bloodlines that might someday challenge the succession. And at the bottom of the 3rd page, written in the Khan's own hand, during what must have been his final coherent hours, an instruction so simple it required no elaboration: let these names vanish as though they never touched the world. Before we continue, remember to subscribe to Sand, Blood and Chains, where the stories that history feared finally speak again. The order was absolute in the way that steppe law was absolute, built on the principle that the Khan's word outlived his body and became more powerful in death because dead men couldn't change their minds or show weakness. And Temuga understood immediately what was being asked of him. Not mere execution. The Horde had armies for that, but something more thorough, the systematic erasure of people from memory, from record, from the oral histories that the shamans kept, and the genealogies that determined marriage rights, and the chronicle stones where victories were carved, and the tribute lists where names appeared as evidence of submission. It was the kind of order that required intelligence rather than force, the careful work of finding every place a name had been written or spoken or remembered, and removing it with the precision of a surgeon cutting rot from healthy flesh. And the council had chosen Temuga for this task, not just because he was the eldest, but because his reputation suggested he could accomplish such erasure without sentiment, without the hesitation that might come from recognizing that names belonged to living humans who had stories and children and reasons for existing beyond their inconvenience to the succession. They gave him authority over the scribes and the tribute collectors, and the shamans who maintained the genealogical records, told him he had 6 months to complete the purge before the formal coronation, when the new Khan would need to present an empire cleansed of ambiguity, and they sent him out into the cold morning with the leather case pressed against his ribs beneath his deal, the heavy silk and wool coat that marked his rank, and he rode from the encampment without escort, because a man on this kind of mission travelled alone, or was not worthy of the task. The steppe in early spring was a place of deceptive distances, where what looked like a hill, an hour's ride away, might take 3 days to reach, or might be a cloud shadow that would dissipate before you covered half the ground. And Temuga had grown up learning to navigate by stars and wind direction and the smell of water that told you where rivers ran, even when you couldn't see them. And he used these skills now to visit the camps and settlements where the Khan's orders needed executing, places where chroniclers kept their records in felt bags protected from rain, where tribal leaders maintained wooden tablets carved with debt obligations and marriage contracts, where the wandering singers carried 8 generations of history in verse that changed slightly with each performance, but retained the essential names that mattered. He had been trained for leadership since childhood, trained specifically in the art of appearing certain even when uncertain, of making decisions that affected thousands, while showing no more emotion than you'd show choosing which horse to ride. And this training had involved exercises that now seemed designed precisely for the work ahead of him, memorizing the names of every significant family in a confederation of tribes, learning to read the subtle differences in dialect that told you which valley a person's ancestors came from, understanding how the steppe's oral culture worked so that you could predict where a name might be preserved even after the person carrying it had died. His father had been building something unprecedented, an empire that spanned from the eastern forests to the western deserts, and maintaining that empire required eliminating the kind of internal fractures that came from people remembering the wrong histories, honoring the wrong ancestors, carrying grudges that predated the unification by generations. Temuge opened the leather case for the first time 3 days into his journey, sitting alone in a camp he'd made in a dry riverbed where the wind wouldn't carry firelight far, and he read through the names with the methodical attention his father had always demanded. And as he read, something began shifting in his chest, a weight accumulating like snow that falls so lightly you don't notice until suddenly you're buried. The first page contained mostly tribal leaders, men he recognized from the campaigns of unification, warriors who had fought brilliantly against the Horde before surrendering with honor. And beside their names were annotations indicating they had sons now of fighting age, who might remember their father's resistance and see it as glory rather than the treason it had become retroactively. The second page listed chroniclers and shamans, people who preserved stories, and Temuge recognized several names as men he'd spoken with during his education, scholars who had taught him the history of the steppe before his father had unified it, who had explained the complex web of alliances and betrayals that made sense of current politics. And the annotations here indicated that their accounts of certain battles made the Khan appear cruel, or suggested that conquered peoples had legitimate grievances that the Horde had ignored. But it was the third page that made his hands stop moving, made the parchment tremble slightly before he forced himself back into stillness, because among the names there he found people he knew personally, not as enemies or political problems, but as humans who had intersected with his life in ways that had nothing to do with power. A woman named Kutulun, who had served in his mother's household and had taught him the songs that calmed horses, whose name was listed for erasure because her brother had been executed for hoarding grain during a famine, and the family line needed severing. A scribe called Yeke, who had personally tutored Temuge in the Uyghur script, and had always smelled of ink made from burned animal bones, whose name appeared because he'd written a chronicle suggesting the Khan's first wife had been murdered rather than died of illness. 3 children from a noble family that had surrendered early and been granted clemency. Names on the list because keeping them alive meant keeping alive the memory of their clan's autonomous past. And Temuge had met these children during a banquet where they'd performed a traditional dance so ancient even the shamans didn't know its origin. The realization came slowly, the way understanding sometimes arrives after your body has already reacted, which was that the names on these pages weren't abstractions or political necessities, but a map of memory, a catalogue of everyone who made the steppe something other than empty grass and wind, who carried in their minds and bloodlines the texture of existence before his father had flattened complexity into empire. Temuge had spent his entire life being prepared to rule, being taught that leadership meant making impossible choices with confidence, that mercy was a luxury that weak men indulged and strong men transcended. But sitting alone in that dry riverbed with the parchment in his hands, he understood suddenly that strength and weakness were more complicated than his training had suggested. That there was a kind of courage required to disobey that was entirely different from the courage required to kill, and that the order sealed with his father's blood was asking him to be not strong, but empty, to hollow himself out until there was nothing left except obedience to a dead man's fear of what living people might remember. He could fulfill the order. He had the authority and the apparatus and the reputation that would make people believe he was doing it efficiently, or he could burn it, and burning it meant betraying everything he'd been raised to believe about duty and loyalty and the sacred nature of a Khan's final word. But it also meant choosing a different kind of loyalty, to the actual humans whose names he'd been ordered to erase, to the living memory of the steppe as something more than his father's property. The burning happened the next night, after Temuga had spent a day riding through territory so empty it seemed like the world had forgotten how to make sound, and when he finally stopped to make camp, he built the fire differently than usual, arranged the dried dung and brush in a pattern that would create maximum heat quickly, and he sat watching the flames establish themselves before he removed the 3 pages from the leather case and held them over the fire long enough that his hands began to hurt from the radiated warmth, and then he released them and watched the parchment curl and blacken, watched the names disappear into ash and smoke that the wind scattered across the steppe like a message sent in a language only the dead could read. The leather case he kept, because disposing of it would raise questions, but he filled it with blank parchment cut to the same size as the original sheets, and over the following days he began constructing the architecture of disobedience, the careful systems and false reports that would convince the council he was executing the purge, while actually doing the opposite, which was warning people, relocating them, forging documents that changed their names in the official records, while preserving their true names in hidden copies that he began assembling like a secret chronicle of survival. It required skills he'd learned for entirely different purposes: how to forge the Khan's seal using wax and a carved stone replica he commissioned from a jeweler who thought he was making a memorial piece, how to intercept messengers by predicting their routes and creating plausible reasons for their delay, how to alter tribute lists by adding and removing names in ways that created confusion rather than clarity, making it appear that administrative chaos rather than deliberate sabotage was preventing the erasure from happening cleanly. The work became a form of cartography, mapping not territory, but the places where names lived, the overlapping systems of memory that constituted identity in a culture where most people couldn't read, but everyone could recite their ancestry back 8 generations. Temuga traveled between camps, interviewing shamans ostensibly to confirm which names needed erasing, but actually to understand how oral history functioned, where the vulnerable points were, which singers were most influential and therefore most dangerous to the preservation effort, because if they were killed or silenced, their version of history would die with them. He commissioned a scribe he trusted, a man named Kassar, who owed Temuga his life from a hunting accident years earlier, to create what they called the Bridge Book, a document that existed in multiple copies, hidden in different locations, written in a modified script that looked like standard Mongolian, but used subtle variations in certain characters that changed the meaning of names, allowing them to survive in plain sight while appearing to any casual inspection to be exactly what the official record showed. The Bridge Book was genius in its simplicity, preserving not just names, but the context that gave them meaning, family connections, locations, significant events, encoded in what looked like mundane tribute records or genealogies that no one would think to question because they appeared to support rather than subvert the official history. But conspiracy requires trust, and trust creates vulnerability. and Temuga began noticing signs that someone was tracking him, comparing his reports to other sources, finding the small discrepancies that always emerge when you're maintaining parallel realities. The first indication came when he arrived at a camp expecting to find a chronicler named Berta, who had been on the erasure list, only to discover that Berta had been arrested 3 days earlier by order of Prince Yochi, Temuga's cousin, a man famous for his administrative precision and his hatred of ambiguity. The second indication came when Temuga's seal, which he'd been using to forge documents, was called into question by a tribute collector who noticed that 2 tablets bearing Temuga's mark showed slightly different impressions, suggesting either the seal had been damaged or someone was creating copies. The third indication came when messengers that Temuga had redirected began arriving at their original destinations with stories of having been waylaid by bandits or delayed by weather, but their stories didn't quite match the actual conditions along the routes they'd traveled, and Yoshi began asking questions about patterns, about why certain names that should have been erased were still appearing in reports from regional administrators, about why the purge was taking so much longer than anticipated, given Temuga's reputation for efficiency. Yoshi was dangerous precisely because he believed in order, in the kind of systematic thinking that had made the Horde's logistics miraculous, that had allowed an army to move across the steppe, carrying its own food and water in carefully calculated quantities, and he approached the mystery of the incomplete purge the way he'd approach any administrative problem, by collecting data and looking for patterns. And the pattern he found was that everywhere Temuga had visited, the erasure became complicated. Names that should have vanished instead became confused. Records that should have been destroyed instead were damaged in ways that made them partially illegible, but not completely lost. And the most damning pattern was that people who should have been dead were alive in different locations, with different names, suggesting not failed execution, but successful relocation. Yoshi confronted Temuga during a council meeting where regional governors were reporting on the purge's progress, and he did it carefully, not as accusation, but as apparent curiosity, asking Temuga to explain why certain families listed on the original orders were now recorded as having died of natural causes before the orders were issued, when tribute records from those same families showed payments made after the supposed death dates. Temuga had prepared for this moment, had created false records suggesting administrative error, confusion caused by similar names in different tribes, the natural chaos of trying to track people across a territory that spanned mountains and deserts and forests. But as he spoke, he could see Yoshi watching not his words, but his hands, looking for the small physical signs that indicated lying, and Temuga realized that his cousin knew, or strongly suspected, and was simply waiting for enough evidence to move from suspicion to accusation. If you're still here, stay until the end. The truth hidden in the final moments will change everything you believe about this chapter of history. The crisis point came during the autumn gathering, when the scattered camps consolidated into a massive temporary city of felt tents that stretched across the steppe like a migration of white birds settled to earth. Thousands of people gathering to celebrate victories and settle disputes and witness the formal coronation of the new Khan. And it was here that Yoshi planned his exposure, waiting until the council was assembled and witnesses were present so that Temuga's shame would be public and complete. Yoshi had collected physical evidence, comparing wax seals under magnification and finding the subtle differences that proved forgery, tracking messengers and discovering that several had been paid to delay their routes, interviewing people whose names were supposed to be erased, and finding them alive and willing to testify that Temuga had warned them. The night before the coronation, Yoshi came to Temuga's tent, not with guards, but alone, which was somehow more threatening because it meant he was confident enough in his evidence that he didn't need force. and he laid out the case with the precision of a man arranging pieces on a game board, and he offered Temuga a choice: confess publicly and accept execution with honor, or be exposed as a traitor with evidence so overwhelming that his name would be erased along with everyone he'd tried to save, his entire lineage declared corrupted and removed from the genealogies as though the family had never existed. Temuga understood immediately that the choice wasn't about what happened to him, but about what happened to the bridge book, to the preserved names, to the scattered copies of the true history that he'd hidden across the steppe, in locations that only he and Kassar knew. And if he confessed and died honorably, those copies would survive, because no one would know to look for them. But if he was exposed as traitor, then Yoki would tear apart everything connected to him until the hidden records were found and destroyed. The decision required sacrificing not his life. He'd accepted that death was inevitable from the moment he burned the orders, but his name, his honor, the memory of everything he'd been before this moment. And he made it the way you'd make any impossible choice. By imagining the people whose names he'd saved having children and grandchildren who would carry forward the stories and songs and genealogies that gave the steppe its texture of meaning. And he realized that he could live with being remembered as traitor if it meant other people got to be remembered at all. He told Yoki he'd confess, write out a full account of his betrayal, appear before the council and accept whatever judgment they pronounced. But he requested one night to put his affairs in order, to write the confession properly, to prepare himself spiritually for death the way tradition demanded. And Yoki agreed, because allowing Temuga this dignity made Yoki appear magnanimous, which was important for a man who might someday compete for succession himself. What Temuga did instead was ride through the night to the place where the Horde kept its central archives, a massive felt tent, reinforced with wooden frames and guarded by elite warriors who controlled access to the scrolls and tablets that constituted the Empire's administrative memory. He had legitimate authority to enter. He was still officially a prince until his confession made him otherwise, and the guards let him pass without question, assuming he was conducting last-minute verification of names before the coronation made the new Khan's authority absolute. Inside, the archive was organized with military precision, scrolls arranged by region and type, tablets stacked according to date, genealogies bound in leather cases that had been treated to resist moisture and insects. And Temuga moved through this organized memory like a man searching for something he'd lost, which, in a sense, was true. He was looking for the copies of the original erasure list that Yoki had submitted as evidence, the documents that would guide the council in hunting down anyone Temuga had tried to save. He found them in a locked chest that he opened using a key he'd stolen from Yochi's tent earlier that day, a small theft that Yochi wouldn't notice until it was too late, and he read through the documents confirming that Yochi had been meticulous, had tracked down not just Temuga's forgeries, but the actual living people, had compiled witness statements and travel records and sealed impressions that together formed an irrefutable accusation. Temuga burned them, used the archive's own lamps to set fire to the evidence, and in the chaos that followed, guards rushing in, people shouting about accidents and sabotage, he managed to scatter the ashes and create enough confusion that no one could say for certain what had been destroyed. And more importantly, he retrieved the bridge book's central copy from its hiding place behind a stack of tribute scrolls, where Kassar had concealed it weeks earlier in preparation for exactly this kind of emergency. The book was small enough to fit inside his deal, bound in leather so worn it looked like garbage rather than precious document, and he carried it out of the burning archive into the cold night while the guards focused on saving what they could of the official records, and he rode from the gathering not toward any destination, but simply away, into the steppe's autumn darkness, where the wind carried the smell of distant snow, and the first stars were appearing in patterns that travelers used for navigation, because the stars were more reliable than human authority. Behind him, He could hear horns sounding alarm, could imagine Yochi discovering both the destroyed evidence and Temuga's disappearance, and understanding immediately what had happened, could picture the riders being assembled for pursuit. But Temuga had grown up on the steppe, and knew things about travel that soldiers didn't, like how to move at night using horse gaits that left minimal tracks, how to cross rocky ground that wouldn't hold hoofprints, how to use rivers and weather to erase your passage from anyone trying to follow. He rode for 3 days without stopping except to let his horse rest, surviving on dried meat and mare's milk he'd brought in his saddlebags, moving generally westward toward territories where the Horde's authority was newer and less absolute, where people still remembered their identities from before the conquest, and might be sympathetic to a prince who'd chosen names over obedience. Along the way, he stopped at the locations where copies of the bridge book had been hidden, collected them from the shepherds and shamans and wayfarers who'd agreed to guard them without knowing what they contained, and he assembled all the fragments into a complete map of preserved memory, hundreds of names that officially no longer existed, but which someone in the future might rediscover and understand, represented not just individuals, but an entire mode of existence that the Empire had tried to flatten into uniform submission. At the final location, a shrine built around a spring that was considered holy by the local tribes, he met Kassar, who had fled the gathering after hearing about the archive fire, and together they buried the bridge book in a copper box that they sealed with wax and marked with symbols that would mean nothing to casual observers, but which told a specific story in the visual language that shamans used for sacred sites, the story of names that survived by hiding, of memory preserved through intentional forgetting, of a prince who chose exile over complicity. The years that followed were erasure of a different kind, Temuga's name gradually disappearing from official accounts, not because anyone ordered it, but because speaking about him became uncomfortable for a court that preferred its heroes uncomplicated and its traitors entirely evil, and he became a story that existed in the gaps between stories, mentioned occasionally as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mercy, sometimes remembered as having died during the succession crisis, other times as having escaped into the western deserts where he lived among bandits, and the truth which was that he survived by moving between small communities that existed outside the Horde's direct administration, working as a translator and scribe, and occasionally as a mediator in disputes that required someone who understood the old tribal laws that the Empire had officially replaced. He grew old in obscurity, his famous coldness transformed into something different, a quiet intensity that people recognized as authority without being able to name why they trusted him. And he never spoke about who he'd been, because speaking would endanger the people who protected him. But sometimes when travelers asked about the history of certain families or the origin of certain songs, he would tell them stories that seemed like folk tales, but which contained names, real names that the official chronicles had removed, preserved in the amber of narrative where they could survive, because stories were harder to kill than documents. Decades after Temuga's disappearance, a merchant traveling through the Western Territories discovered what he thought was a shrine that locals visited without clear understanding of what it commemorated. And being curious, he excavated the area around the spring and found a copper box that had been sealed well enough to keep moisture out, but not time. And inside were fragments of leather and parchment that had deteriorated badly, but which still showed traces of the Mongolian script, and among the legible passages were lists of names accompanied by brief notations, family connections, significant deeds, the locations where these people had lived before the Empire absorbed their territories. The merchant brought these fragments to the court, thinking they might be valuable historical documents, and they were examined by chroniclers who couldn't determine their purpose or origin, and they were eventually filed among the miscellaneous records, where they remained untouched for centuries, occasionally rediscovered by historians trying to understand gaps in the official accounts, used as evidence that the Horde's administrative systems were more complex than previously understood, but never connected to the prince whose name had been so thoroughly erased that even stories about his erasure had been erased, leaving only the names he'd saved as proof that someone had cared enough about preservation to risk everything. But names endure in ways that power doesn't anticipate, and in the regions where Temuga had lived during his exile, the old songs survived, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from singer to apprentice, and these songs contained genealogies that didn't match the official records, that preserved family connections the empire had tried to sever, and they told stories about a prince who learned that true strength meant choosing what to remember rather than what to destroy. And while the songs never used his name, using it would have made the songs dangerous, something the authorities might suppress. They described a figure who moved through the world, leaving behind not monuments or conquered cities, but possibilities, the chance for people to remain themselves, even inside an empire that demanded uniformity. In one village, there was a carved post at the boundary marker, old enough that no one remembered who'd made it, and the carving showed a horse and rider turning away from the rising sun, which most people interpreted as a traveler heading west. But a few shamans who maintained oral traditions knew it represented something else, a person of high birth who'd chosen exile over obedience, and they kept this interpretation alive not because they thought anyone would care about ancient political disputes, but because the image meant something about the possibility of defiance, about the space between what authority demands and what conscience allows. Temuga himself died alone in a felt tent during a spring storm, surrounded by people who knew him as a translator and didn't know he'd once been called the Unmoved. And there was no funeral because he'd requested that his body be left for the sky burial that was traditional for shamans and people whose spirits needed to return to the steppe unencumbered. And the people who'd cared for him in his final years told their children that he'd been someone important once, but the details were lost. And that was enough, the kind of partial preservation that Temuga himself had practiced, keeping the essential truth alive while letting the dangerous specifics dissolve into time. But the names survived, carved into boundary markers and preserved in songs and hidden in documents that would be rediscovered centuries later by scholars trying to understand how empire functioned in practice rather than theory. And these scholars would notice anomalies, places where the oral history didn't match the written records, families whose genealogies contained people who officially never existed, and they would construct theories about administrative chaos and conflicting record-keeping systems, never imagining that the chaos had been deliberate, that someone with the authority to erase had chosen instead to scramble, to create enough confusion that truth could hide inside it and survive, and that this person had paid for the choice with everything except the satisfaction of knowing that memory was more durable than power. That names spoken in love were stronger than names written in command, and that the steppe would remember what mattered not because anyone ordered it remembered, but because people chose to carry it forward, generation after generation, until the names became part of the landscape itself, as permanent as the rivers and as impossible to erase as the wind. If this story moved you, subscribe to Sand, Blood and Chains. Here, the forgotten truths of the ancient world live again. No matter how hard history tried to erase them, tentar novamente.